So I'm going to take you from the spiritual to the historical, from the lofty to the mundane. And I also learned very early on, I used to go into class without notes and I would lecture and nobody would take notes. So I realized that they didn't take me seriously. So usually now what I do, I take empty sheets of paper and I put them on the podium and I lecture and everybody's taking notes. But these papers do have some notes to keep me on time, and I'm going to watch the clock. What I'm going to talk about is an overview of the encounter between Christianity and Islam. And maybe I should start with my experience since emigrating to the United States. I came to the United States in 1963. My husband was a student at Harvard. He started teaching at Princeton. I went with some faculty wives to the Philadelphia Museum. On the way back, one of his colleagues' wife asked me, "Where are you from?" I said, "Jordan," because my husband is Jordanian and I had just come from Jordan. She said, "Georgia?" I said, "No, Jordan." "Oh," she said, "Lawrence of Arabia, going into the desert, camels." And I said, "I guess so." She said, "Whoever civilized you did a very good job." So I had no idea what she was saying. I knew I was insulted, but I didn't know what to say. Why was I civilized? What makes me civilized? I still don't know, but I have since then thought of many ways I could have answered. But I still don't know why I'm supposed to be civilized. But that was the stereotype of Arabs and Muslims in the United States in the 1960s, the camel jockey. In the 1970s, especially after the 73 oil boycott, the sort of stereotype shifted dramatically so that now the Arab and the Muslim are the oil sheik. And you begin to have cartoons in which you have a man walking with 4 wives behind him, and they're out to destroy our economy. They're greedy, and sort of they hate us, and they want to sort of suck our civilization from its power. By the 80s, the stereotype shifted again. That's when you had the Munich Olympics and you had the terrorism, and so the Arab and the Muslim became the terrorist. But was a terrorist over there? So people began to show pictures of terrorists and Arabs and Muslims, and in a very funny way, if you look at the cartoons of the period, you will see that the image of the Arab became almost identical with the image of the Jewish person in the 19th century stereotypes of Europe. Hook nose, their mind is full of evil, and other anti-Semitic stereotypes were transformed or transmitted into Arab and Muslim. Now you may wonder why I'm saying Arab and Muslim. In the United States, if we talk about Arabs, there's 3 million Arabs. Of these, 2 million are Christian, and 1 million are Muslim. The majority of Muslims are non-Arabs. Okay, they come from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Iran, and there are 57 nation states in the United States. So when we talk about Arab, we usually cover the Christians and the secular Muslims. And then we talk about Muslims, it includes all the other Muslims, including the Arabs who identify as Muslim, primarily as Muslim rather than Arab. Now in the 90s, the stereotype shifted again, and the Arabs and the Muslims became the enemy. By 2001, they became evil. And I want you to hear that, because there is a difference between an enemy and evil. An enemy is somebody you fight, you may kill their son, your daughter might marry their son, you may make a peace with them, learn to live together. Evil is something more intense. Evil is something that you have to eradicate, no matter what your religion is. Whether you're Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Jain, whatever your religion is, your God has told you to eradicate evil. And what the society has done is to sort of posit Islam as evil. And I think that that is a danger, as has been told to you by many other speakers. What I want to do is take us back into history, just sort of an overview of this encounter between the Arab world, the Muslim world, and Christianity. Islam came out in Arabia, and there was a context of some Christians, the wrong kind of Christians for most people in the West, and Jews. So it is a context in which the Abrahamic faiths were there. It came at a time where Byzantium was the power, where Byzantine Christianity was the dominant Christianity in the area. But that doesn't mean that there weren't other Christians. There were the sort of heretics, the people who were called the Monophysites, because they believed in one nature of Christ, whether it was that his divine nature superseded his human nature, or that his human nature superseded his divine nature. I know you don't want to hear about that, but I also want you to know that these Christians who were Monophysites were being persecuted by the Byzantine Christians. And so when Islam came out of Arabia, these persecuted heretics welcomed the liberation from Byzantine Empire. So you have the Monophysites of Syria and Palestine, the Copts of Egypt, welcoming the Muslims because they were their liberators. And then you have the encounter between the Islamic Empire, or the Islamic Caliphate, and Byzantium. And what the Byzantines did, especially St. John of Damascus, he's the first to write about Islam, and he listed them as one of the heresies of Christianity. So he was writing a book about Christian heresies, and he'd heard about the Muslims. He thought, yes, they are Aryans. So they're a sect of Aryanism, because they didn't recognize the divinity of Christ. So from the beginning, the Christian church has looked at Islam as the other, as something not acceptable. But we also know that when the Muslims were being persecuted in Mecca, they took refuge with the Christians of Ethiopia, who were Copts. And when they went there, their enemies followed. And they said to the Negus, or the king of Ethiopia, give them back to us. And he said, first I want to test them. So he asked them, what do you believe in? And they recited chapter 19 of the Quran, which is the Surah of Mary, and it's about the birth of Jesus. And he said, no, I want to protect these people. So from the beginning, Christians protected the Muslims. And in some of the Sunday school material that came out in the 80s, in Muslim Sunday school literature, they talk about living in America as sort of like living in Ethiopia, in which the Muslims and the Christians live together and work together. Now, Islam spread, of course, and then what you have is the encounter with Catholicism. We're done with Byzantium. Catholicism comes in, the Pope comes out with an edict, and he says that go to the east. If you kill the infidel, you'll go straight to heaven. And they marched, and they came, and it's very interesting, because I study history. If you look at the history of Islam, you will see at the time Crusades took place, people were not looking at them as soldiers of Christ. Rather, they were called the Franks, and they were a threat, but they lived there for 100 years, and during these 100 years, they had collaboration with local Muslim leaders, and they fought against other Christian knights, and Muslims fought against each other, so they became localized. But what happened in 100 years of Crusader presence in the Middle East is that Eastern Christianity was sort of destroyed. Before the coming of the Crusades, the majority of the people in the area were Christian. 100 years later, when the Crusades left, the majority were Muslim. Now, some Christians converted, others left, but we know that when the Crusades went in, they didn't like the local Christians because they were the other, because they were not Catholic. So what you have is they destroyed the 5 centers of Eastern Christianity: Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, Edessa, and Constantinople. Now, my mother was born in Antioch, my father in Tarsus, and I was raised, you know, we're the original Christians, and all you guys are Johnny-come-lately. But basically, my mother was taught that when the Crusaders came, they came through this hole in the wall and they killed our ancestors. Because if you look at the Crusaders' reports about what they did, you will see that the blood of the people in Antioch, especially in Jerusalem, was up to the knees, to the ankles. When the Crusaders were in Mara, they were hungry and starving, so they chopped up meat from the dead bodies and made kebab. And they write about it in their reports. And so there is that legacy which is now being rediscovered by the Muslims, and suddenly Crusades are very important. Not when they took place, but today as Muslims look back at history and they begin to see that the Western Church has been obsessed with destroying Islam. Then when the Crusades left, they had decided they couldn't wipe the Muslims out. As, you know, Sheikh Raouf said yesterday, Abdul Raouf. So what they did is they decided we can now convert them. It's a different way of getting rid of Islam. So they started trying to learn about Islam in order to undermine it. This is extremely important, because this is also part of the heritage, and it's all published and available. Now, you have is Cluny, the abbot of Cluny decided, okay, we're going to convert them, so let's first of all know what's in their Quran. So he authorized the translation of the Quran into Latin. It was translated, and of course the translator wanted to make sure that nobody thought that he was really touching this awful book. So the book starts with, against this heresy that I renounce, and you know, just in the introduction. So everybody would know that he really didn't believe in any of it. He was just doing a duty. But at the same time, the Cluny abbot was interested in getting rid of the Muslims who were now in Spain. Now, the Muslims were in Spain for 800 years. During that period, they established a thriving civilization in collaboration with the Jewish community and some of the Christians. If you look at the historical events, you will see that they were invited into Spain by the Jews who were being persecuted by the Catholics of Spain, who told them, please come and help us. And so then you have a collaboration of Jewish-Muslim civilization, which in Jewish history it's considered the golden age of Judaism. And so what the Catholics were obsessed with is how do we get rid of them? So when you have the Reconquista, the Reconquista was the sort of the conquest of Spain by the Catholics, and the first is the expulsion of the Jews, and then the expulsion of the Muslims, and they were given 3 choices. You can leave, you can convert, or you can die. Now, if you convert, then you have to go through an investigation, because they wanted to know if you would eat meat secretly, do you fast secretly. We know that recently when they had built a mosque in Spain, they were going to dedicate it, and out of the woodworks, about 500 people showed up who had been secret Muslims for 500 years. Because they did not, you know, they were afraid they had kept their religion secret. Now, that was the encounter with Catholicism, and part of it was the discovery of the United States. Because Christopher Columbus was sent by the King and Queen of Spain to look for Prester John, so they could have, Prester John is this mythical figure in European history, he was a Christian, he lived somewhere in the East, and they were going to have a pincer operation in which they would wipe out the Muslims, because there was pressure on Europe from the Ottomans from the East, and there was European Spain, and having sort of gotten rid of the Muslims from the real Spain, they really didn't want them to come to the new Spain, which is what America was called at the time, I mean afterwards. So what happened is Christopher Columbus was sent to find Prester John, and he looked for, this is why the 3 ships he had one person who spoke Arabic. And that was because they expected to meet some people who knew Arabic. Of course, he got lost and found the United States instead. Now, the encounter, that sort of brings us to the 3rd encounter, which is with Protestantism, because we've done now Orthodoxy and Catholicism. The Protestants were the major force with Dutch colonialism and British colonialism. So when they went in, the colonial powers took with them the missionaries, and the missionaries were out to convert the Muslims. And they tried. They were successful in some places, and for example, in Indonesia, in Iran, in non-Arab countries. In the Arab world, when I was interviewing one person from the Congregational Church, now called the United Church of Christ, he told me that during the over 100 years in which the Board of Foreign Missions had worked in the Arab world, 5 Arabs converted to Islam, and more missionary children converted, 5 converted to Christianity, and more missionary children converted to Islam. But that was the major effort of converting them. Now this sort of colonial missionary outreach, or whatever you want to call it, in Muslim terms it's the New Crusades, was conceived as civilizational mission. So Huntington did not invent the idea that we're going to civilize them and that they had a different civilization. That's what the colonial powers were about. You have, the French had a civilizing mission, the British, white man's burden, and the Americans later took on manifest destiny. But the whole idea is we're good, and we're going to teach our great values to the rest of the world. Now, what happened, I want to look at the missionaries in particular, is because they left a legacy, and especially a legacy of education in which you bring modernization, and everybody looked at it as something wonderful. But they also looked at the Muslims as really horrible people, and the stereotypes were 2. That they were really authoritarian, and the second is they oppressed their women. And when the French went into Algeria, they told the Algerians, Algeria is not Algeria, it's France. And so you have all the French people going to settle Algeria, and they announced that anybody can become a French citizen now because Algeria is France. But there is one thing you have to do, just one thing. You have to renounce the Sharia. Does that make sense? Do you hear me? You have to renounce the Sharia, then you can become French citizen. We'll give you a passport. When they went in, they gave all the Jews of Algeria a French passport. But the Muslims had one hurdle to overcome. They had to renounce the Sharia. The Sharia is something very interesting to look at because the Sharia, as Sheikh yesterday told you, Abdul Rauf, is 2 things. One part is the rituals, the 5 things he talked about: prayer, fasting, giving alms, going to the Hajj, and the Shahada, which is the announcement that I believe in God and in the Prophet Muhammad. Now, half the book on Sharia would be about that. Okay? The other half would be about how you translate this relationship to God, because that is ibadat, how you worship God, the 5 things you do. Then you translate what you do, mu'amalat, which is your relationship to human beings. How does this, your relationship to God, relate to your relationship to other people? There is no one that I have seen going around carrying these posters saying, we are against the Sharia, Sharia kills. What they're saying is, Muslims cannot be Muslim, because they have to get rid of the 5 things of worship. That's the beginning of the Sharia. That's what comes first. Your announcement that you believe there is no God but God, Muhammad is his prophet, your prayer 5 times a day, you're fasting, you're giving alms and going to the Hajj. It is the core of the teachings of Islam. There is the other part, but everybody mixes them together. So what the Muslims are hearing overseas is, we're against Islam. And I read the Arab press, and they believe that the United States had declared war on Islam because we want to eradicate the Sharia, which means that they cannot pray. They cannot announce that they believe in God and the Prophet Muhammad. So it's extremely important that people learn to understand what they are doing. Because, you know, in this day and age, overseas, you know, they hear the contra-Muslim people before we do. It hits the headlines over there. And they think that we are on a new crusade to kill Muslims and to get them to renounce Islam. Now, these colonial powers, when they went in the 16th century and culminated after the First World War, at that time there were 3 Muslim empires. The Ottoman Empire, which is Turkey, some of the stands, part of the Arab world, North Africa, the Safavid Empire, which is Iran, Afghanistan, parts of India, Pakistan, and the Mughal Empire, which is, India, Pakistan. And what happened is, during this 2, 3, 4 centuries of empire, when they left 57 nation states that are considered to be Islamic at the moment. They are members of the Organization of Islamic Conference. So you go from 3 Muslim empires to 57 nation states. And each one of these nation states now has to teach its young people its history. How do you create a national identity by teaching this history I just talked about? So when a Muslim comes to this country or to Europe, he's carrying a suitcase. There are a few things in that suitcase, maybe some pictures, maybe some ethnic food, but he's carrying a big burden of this history. A history which, from their perspective, is this West which is obsessed with eliminating Islam. A West that cannot rest until it transforms their women. Now, in the United States, I want to make sure that you remember that the first country that recognized the American Republic when the United States rebelled against the Brits was Morocco. Okay? So the first embassy was to Morocco. And anybody who goes to the Washington Zoo, I want you to know it was formed because the Dai of Morocco gave the ambassador a lion. And the ambassador sent a letter to Congress and said, what shall I do with the lion? By the time the letter came, he had to go see the king, whatever he is. And he told him, oh, they loved the lion. So they gave him another lion. And the letter came from the Congress that says, get rid of it, we don't want it. But he already said that they loved it. By the time the letter came, the other letter, it had babies. So they shipped them, and that was how the Washington Zoo was established. Okay? I'm not making this up. Okay. But the first war that the United States engaged in was against the Barbary States, which is North Africa. And the reason was when the Americans were under British control, they could trade. But once the revolution took place, the Brits turned to the Barbary States and said, you know, those are Americans, they're flying different flags, you go after them. So they started attacking American ships, and so the Americans hit back. Now, to me, this is an episode in history. What is most interesting about it is to read the propaganda for war at the time. And the propaganda for war is these swarthy, horrible men. They're awful men, and they oppress their women. And if you look at the propaganda for war for Afghanistan, it's almost identical, word for word. We are still obsessed with these horrible men who are, always out to kill us with scimitars or whatever, now with nukes, I guess. And then the fact that they oppress their women. So I think my time is up. I should wrap up. One of the things that I want to make sure you keep in mind is we have always been obsessed with their women. Because I read the records of the missionaries. They used to come to the United States and go to different churches and report about, these poor women. And then they would say, we in the Christian church, we wouldn't do this. This is why feminism came out of the Christian churches. Because most of these women missionaries were feminists. And they came in and made sure that those oppressed women over there, right, is something that you don't want in the churches in the United States. The condition in the United States was similar. But you say, we Christians wouldn't do that, now would we? And so all you have to do is read their letters and the little church, suppers they attended and what they said, especially in New York State. It's very interesting information of how they depicted their women. But most of that is they depicted them as oversexed. And that's what all the movies in the early part of the 20th century were about, As long as you had naked women or half-naked women who were Muslim over there, you could watch them on the movie, but not Christian women. But they were over there, it's okay. Now we want to liberate them because they don't have enough sex. Because they have a society that is too constrained, they want to cover their women up, so we have to uncover them. But the thing is that we have changed in our morality and what we expect the role of women to be. And we still want to impose it on them. And we cannot tolerate that they would have a different view of what it means to be a woman. And I'll stop here. If anybody wants to ask questions, I will be able to answer them afterwards because I know it's past lunchtime.